The first of which I want to talk about the weekend that was, because there's certainly, I mean, I don't really want to say that it's unprecedented, but it felt a bit more busier than usual, with four major events, not to mention Collision. So, Jack, as somebody who certainly covered a lot of it, how much did you get to watch and what stood out to you about this weekend?
Yeah, there was a story today on F4W Online that mentioned that this weekend there was, between all the big brands in North America, 17 hours of TV and like special events and things like that. I don't think you could find one person who watched every single minute of that. And if they do, I hope they're doing okay. I hope they're recovering well today. I was able to catch Night of Champions, and then I was also able to cover Forbidden Door for the site. I'm going to get around to watching Slammiversary. It is one of the bigger shows of the year for TNA. And, I'll try to catch what's important on Great American Bash for NXT. That's the first time on the CW, and I was kind of curious to see what the pacing is like doing a PLE on TV, like the full 3 hours on TV. But really, I just focused on those two, the two most important shows this weekend, knowing the limited amount of time I had.
I sense that might reflect a lot of people's consumptions. I mean, maybe most of the people listening to this podcast might have only just focused on Forbidden Door, but we certainly had, maybe the most of the talk coming out of the weekend, I feel, surrounding Forbidden Door and also Sami Zayn's title win. Those two probably being the bigger stories. I did get a chance to watch the two title matches on NXT between Naraku and Tony D. Something that I thought would be the big news event of the show, because I was predicting a title change for that particular match. It ended up opening the show, and with Tony D winning, seemed to just be more of a midpoint chapter in their story. Like, to me, Naraku still seems like somebody that I would expect to get a title reign, maybe from Tony D, but that seems to be delayed for now. Extending the Tony D run a little bit longer, maybe, I'm sure they have their reasons. So we'll see what happens there. Kendall Gray and Lola Vice was a terrific match, and
no surprise.
They have in Kendall Gray somebody who, is already an immediate star. I would even say, based in that system, somebody who's shot to the top very quickly. And she is, of course, being pushed in the mold of a Kurt Angle, but she's not comparatively short like a Chad Gable is. So therefore, I think you have a lot more confidence in the way that they would push her in her ascension to the top than maybe somebody also of a Kurt Angle mold like a Chad Gable, and how long it's taken him to get to his spot. Would you expect, how far do you think like her or Lola Vice are from debuting on the main roster, Jack?
Well, honestly, I think Lola Vice has really put everything together as of late. And that's kind of why I was thinking maybe they would give her a longer title run. I mean, she just won the title at Stand and Deliver, correct me if I'm wrong. And that was, a couple months ago now. So honestly, I was surprised that she dropped the belt here, especially with the arguments that, Kendall Gray's the type of person who 2 years into her career, you don't need to rush her into a title run per se, as much as she is ready for this position for sure. These opportunities are going to come back around for her. There was a lot of debate about that, especially heading into this weekend. Lola Vice, I would say, definitely ready for a main roster call up. I think the frustrating thing with main roster discussion is just like every time we have this discussion, it kind of loops back to someone's ready, but like where can they go? And, we're talking about a SmackDown that just went down to 2 hours and has a pretty, well-stocked women's division at the moment. And a Monday Night Raw, which is 2.5 hours right now. So I think she's ready. Whether they give her that, I'm not too sure. Kendall Gray, I would prefer her to get a little more time at NXT. She is, an incredible in-ring talent. I think we haven't seen too much of that character of hers on the mic and things like that could still cook a little more down there.
Yeah, the conversation, like really after any title change, is about whether or not, like, how soon that person will end up on the main roster. But at this point, the conversation is more about where the room is for that person to debut on the main roster. And in the case of like, Lola, I think she's proven something, in being able to like cut the promos that she's been able to cut as a champion. But I also think she could probably still use a little bit more seasoning, but it would not hurt, especially like for somebody like her who I don't think has really like ventured off into the heel side of things too much. They kind of like to give both runs to somebody before they make their debut. And I'm kind of curious if they might play around with her as a heel for a little bit. But certainly for both of them, I see within the year, the calendar year in NXT, but making their debut, because there's so many people waiting for their spots currently in NXT right now. So it's just a cycle of names that keeps moving.
It's July on the Post Wrestling Cafe, and that means our extensive G1 coverage begins starting July 11th. We're going to have reviews of every single G1 card right up to and including the finals in the middle of August. Plus, Rewind Away takes a look at 2 episodes of Heels. We're also going to be going back to 2005 for a review of WrestleMania 21, and it is the start of our double shot episodes covering this season of Dark Side of the Ring. Plus, we are going to dive into the 3rd season of WWE Unreal. All that and so much more can be yours by signing up to the Post Wrestling Cafe. It gets you XL editions of Rewind to Raw, Dynamite, and SmackDown, Collision Course on a weekly basis, MCU later, and so much more.
Maybe just to kind of top the conversation here about the weekend, not to say like this is the be all and end all, but I do think like Cage Match and Cage Match ratings offer some level of maybe reflection of maybe how well received these shows have been to maybe a certain section of the audience, not the entire audience, but a certain section of it. And I do want to go through some of those right now, just because it's somewhat interesting discussion on Cage Match. As far as WWE NXT Great American Bash goes, the show currently has a 6.44 rating, and keep in mind this is not a very high. Like there are not a ton of people that are rating the show right now, but if you want to get a sense of maybe what the people are rating highly here, Kendall Gray versus Lola Vice currently has an 8.15. That is followed by Zarya and Tatum Paxley at an 8.04, and then Naraku and Tony D 6.48 as maybe the 3 most notable matches. And then just maybe on that note, I did want to also look at some of these other shows because Night of Champions has, let me just bring that up, Night of Champions Cage Match. Well, I have it here. I won't bring it up here, but maybe no surprise, the main event between Sami Zayn, Gunther, and Cody Rhodes currently enjoys an 8.70 rating. That is followed by Rollins Breaker at 7.36, then down to Io and Liv at 6.33. And this is where we get failing grades here for Obafemi versus Jey Uso at 4.8, followed by Trick Williams and Ricky Saints at 4.72, and at the very bottom, Tiffany Stratton and Jade Cargill at a 3.6. Do you disagree or agree with some of these ratings there?
To be honest with you, Cage Match does get a lot of flack. I am a self-admitted inmate. I'm one of the people on the site contributing to these ratings. I would say most of these the figures you read off there very much align with how I felt about matches. I do think that ratings on the site can very much skew sometimes less about a specific performance and more about the general sentiment about that wrestler in that moment in time, and that definitely contributes to it. The very high rating of the main event on Night of Champions, I would say, is very deserving. That was a great moment. I saw some people complaining about Sami Zayn getting the title opportunity, winning the title on a show like Night of Champions, an afternoon broadcast that maybe less people would be tuning into. I feel like him winning in a position where he was sort of the C side, not even the B side, but the C side of a rivalry, I think is almost like very apropos of his entire underdog persona through his WWE career. So I love that decision. But yeah, it's hard to really complain with most of the ratings that we're looking at here.
Yeah, I think from a match quality standpoint, I wouldn't really disagree. I'm somebody who actually felt the Trick and Saints match probably I dislike more than Stratton and Cargill, but it does give you an overall sense of maybe how poorly received much of the matches on the show were, and that might include Obafemi and Jey Uso for some people, which I considered a fine match in terms of just what they're going for. But in terms of match quality and maybe showing you a little bit about maybe, I don't know, audience dissatisfaction about a Jey Uso wrestling style, that was reflected here, certainly in a cage match. Just maybe for the, to include in the conversation, it's not getting much attention, but TNA Slammiversary did also take place. And I mean, judging by the people that actually watched the show and rated on Cage Match, I mean, it seemed like at least overall favorable. You have 4 matches above 7 here, including 7.41 for the Nick Nemeth Mike Santana match, then 7.53 for Mustafa Ali taking on Rich Swann and the debuting Uha Nation, former Apollo Crews, 7.25 for Moose and Eddie Edwards, and then 7.15 for the Ultimate X match. So not a ton of buzz again for the show, but from the people that seem to watch it, they at least seem decently satisfied. any thoughts on perhaps, how the weekend might have gone in terms of at least conversation for TNA?
I don't want to get too philosophical about whether all PR is good PR and things like that, but I did find it unfortunate for TNA this weekend that I didn't see much positive, I didn't see much negative, I didn't see much anything on TNA this weekend because they were just swallowed by all the competition that were around them. And at times, going head to head, I think the end of the TNA card kind of overlapped with the start of NXT and things like that. So, the show didn't have a train wreck like last year's Slammiversary was, which got a huge spotlight and kind of was like the talk of the town that weekend that it happened. So I don't know if this is like a necessarily a good thing that it wasn't such a disaster like last year, or if it's a bad thing because it wasn't a disaster, but you didn't really see any talk about it.
It's a really tough spot for somebody like a TNA because the only time we might discuss it is when something exceptional happens, either good or bad. It's much tougher to create something exceptionally good, especially when you're dealing with a limited budget and you're having to compete with these rosters, right? So certainly the talk of the weekend, as you would expect, by far the strongest show of the weekend, at least according to the inmates over at cagematch.com. AEW Forbidden Door, which currently sits at an overall 9.42 total rating. Now, this currently represents it being the 5th highest pay-per-view rating in AEW's history. Double or Nothing from last month still leads at a 9.62. So maybe just to give you a sense of, these back 1-2 shots of AEW pay-per-views and how high both of them have ranked. As far as like the individual matches go, the highest rated match here, based on 277 votes, is Mercedes Moné versus Maya World at a 9.21. Would you agree with that, first of all? What was your match of the night? I want to ask.
I absolutely agree with the ratings here. I thought that was a star-making performance for Maya World, who was put in a 25-minute epic with Mercedes Moné. And, I don't think that's the type of position she's necessarily been in, especially on a card as big as an AEW pay-per-view before. And she absolutely delivered. And there was so much drama in that match. And I think that, especially for people who are very deep into wrestling, like you and I and a lot of the listeners, that sort of suspension of disbelief can wear off after years of watching wrestling, because you're so used to thinking about sort of the behind the scenes of it and everything. This was a match where I was completely hooked on the drama of it, and I think it's very rare for a match to do that. And I think it was easily on a show where we had matches like Kenny Omega versus Zack Sabre Jr. This was the match of the night. So in terms of, to me, like in ring, I don't think it was the best match on the show, but in terms of emotion, especially emotion that broke through the fiction of professional wrestling, of course, there's a huge argument to be had about this being maybe the emotional high of the entire show. But just to give you a point of comparison of what else was on the show, Kenny Omega versus Zack Sabre Jr., currently sitting at a 9.00 rating. And then following that, like... It's pretty crazy. The steel cage, Ospreay versus Swerve Strickland at an 8.94, followed by the steel cage match at an 8.93. So you're talking about 4 matches on this particular show that are sitting at above or slightly below a 9. And again, you consider whatever you will of maybe the cage match audience and their particular sort of taste, but there are a lot of those people, and you can argue those are the exact types of people that the AEW sickos should be, and they were incredibly satisfied with tonight's show. Last night's show. It's funny that I was looking at the lineup and going, oh man, like people kind of underrated Tekla and Starlight Kid, and then I realized it's still a match that has a 7.71 rating, and that's an amazing rating for a match to have. That was one of my highlights of the night. I guess if there's one thing I want to talk about with Forbidden Doors, I kind of want to ask you, like, when I was looking at the lineup and looking at the bout order especially, I had this sort of thought of like, geez, like the final 2-3 hours that the show really didn't have much, if any, inclusion in terms of cross-promotional matchups. And it sort of had me thinking, like, I don't think Forbidden Doors is the type of thing that should be shelved forever. I think it has value. It is a sort of one of the returning assets in AEW that people really resonate with. But does it need to necessarily happen every single year if this is sort of how the card turns out? Because as much as it was a stellar card, a lot of this didn't really feel like a show that was actually being cross promoted, and I feel like that sentiment sort of passes down to past Forbidden Doors as well. But I really felt that this weekend.
Yeah, with the growing strength of AEW and I mean the declining strength of a New Japan Pro Wrestling, this argument has certainly been stronger than ever this year. But I also feel like these things might ebb and flow. You're talking about a New Japan right now that doesn't really have like your big marquee star that feels like a worthwhile sort of like dream match type of challenger. Like Zack Sabre aside, but he's sort of a given every year. And I'm talking about somebody like who's being positioned as the ace of the company. I don't think a Yota Tsuji coming in would really sort of like create that level of buzz just yet. But that's not to say a year from now he won't be able to offer that. I also think like the Forbidden Door name itself now has grown to become like one of their bigger shows of the year, and I would assume like, again, we don't really have the metrics. Tony was asked about them for this show. He doesn't have them yet. I imagine we will hear about them shortly. And I also imagine that this show will have done decently well, maybe just off of name value alone. So I think it's worth keeping the Forbidden Door name. Whether or not you actually keep the concept, that's another question. And I think like this year they actually handled it well. They didn't defer to the concept by having, your dream New Japan crossover match at the top. They chose to prioritize their own stories first, but still giving you enough of the, New Japan CMLL contributions to fit the theme of the show. And I think that's fine. You still get to use the name. You still get to say that there are crossovers on the show, but you're still ultimately featuring AEW stories at the top, which is what the audience is mainly interested in. So yeah, I think they'll keep it. But I also think it'll probably be similar to this,
Yeah, I think that there is room for a sort of super card that feels like sort of an all-star weekend in its matchups, the best of everybody sort of coming together. And that's not what Forbidden Door was last weekend. Don't get me wrong, it was easily the winner of the weekend and a stellar pay-per-view. AEW's been just on a roll pay-per-view wise this year. But I just think like the amount of importance that was during Forbidden Door put on pushing forward AEW storylines, I think there is room for something, including all these promotions, that is more focused strictly on those sort of crossover matchups. I think to what New Japan did years ago when they did the historic crossover with Stardom, and how that very much was dream matches and one-off matches and things like that. It's something to think about, I think.
Now that you have My AEW as a service, I mean, I guess they have to kind of figure this out, like what it would be domestically. But like you can now offer your sort of lower, like I don't want to call them pay-per-views, I don't want to call them PLEs, I want to call them like maybe just a step below that. Something you might just offer strictly as a myaew.com special that you're not charging like a higher price tag for. And I say this knowing that like outside of like North America, you pay one fee and you get everything. So I don't know how you would make that distinction. But I mean, for America, perhaps they can use the space to offer something that's strictly, get people in through the door at My AEW, not charging them a full AEW pay-per-view price. And maybe that could be one of these sort of concept shows,
Yeah, I guess what's interesting on the business aspect of that is, Tony Khan has spoken at length about how the pay-per-view schedule they have right now is very successful for them, and he's very happy with the number of pay-per-views that they're putting on an annual basis. And I don't know if doing a special like that, if that means like trading in a pay-per-view to do a special that wouldn't be necessarily a pay-per-view. I don't know if they would necessarily want to do that.
Yeah. Well, they got these Global War specials happening in Ring of Honor, which is sort of like that concept, right?
It's true.
But yeah, like if you build it as AEW Global Wars, would it make any sort of like significant dent in, well, like, I don't know, AEW signups or My AEW signups or whatnot? I maybe it's worth playing around with, in the future.